an impeachment should succeed or fail. We are accordingly not satisfied with the broad proposition advanced by some of the petitioners that the Speaker's mere participation in the proceedings or involvement in political agreements is sufficient to establish constitutional bias or conflict of interest. The constitutional decision makers under Article 145 and Article 150 are members of Parliament and senators collectively acting through the respective houses of Parliament. We therefore find that the allegations of bias, predetermination, and conflict of interest advanced by the petitioners against the Speaker's members of Parliament and senators are, on the material before this court, no more than bare and unsubstantiated assertions grounded in political inference and suspicion, rather than in objective evidence capable of satisfying the test authoritatively prescribed in the Rai, Rawal, and Tunoi decisions.
The other main issue relates to public participation. In dealing with this topic, we address ourselves to three distinct but interrelated questions. First, whether the public participation exercise conducted by the National Assembly met the constitutional threshold required under Articles 10 and 118 of the Constitution. Second, whether the Senate, upon receipt of the impeachment motion, was itself obligated to carry out a public participation exercise before voting on the impeachment. And third, whether the public participation was required at the point of nomination and appointment of His Excellency Kindiki as Deputy President. The petitioners collectively contended that public participation in the impeachment process was constitutionally deficient, inadequate, and in certain stages wholly absent, rendering the entire process null and void. Their challenge was mounted at the three levels, and the petitioner advanced they attacked the National Assembly's public participation exercise as being deficient, both in substance and procedure. They argued that the public was given less than 48 hours to digest complex charges, that the template used reduced their participation to binary support or not support choice, that His Excellency Gachagua's own response was withheld, depriving citizens of balanced information, that many venues were inaccessible, changed without notice, or restricted to party members. They also pointed to defiance of conservatory orders requiring constituency-level hearings, the vagueness of the same-day notice of the 5th October 2024, anomalies in the participation report, such as a report support rate exceeding 100%, and tabling of that report moments before the debate. They also concluded that the scale of participation of about 200,000 citizens out of a population of 52 million was negligible and incapable of meeting the constitutional standards. With respect to the Senate, they contended that Senate conducted no public participation at all, no notices were issued, no hearings convened, no submissions received. They emphasized Senate's role was determinative and quasi-judicial, and therefore attracted an independent obligation to facilitate public participation. They argued that this obligation could not be discharged vicariously through the National Assembly, and that by proceeding without its own engagement, the Senate compounded the defects of the Assembly's process and arrogated sovereign power that the Constitution requires to be exercised by the people. Finally, they challenged the approval of H.E. Kindiki as deputy president and argued that no public participation preceded the vote, yet that approval constitutes what is known as other business under Article 118, 1B, which requires public involvement. They highlighted the compressed timelines in the Senate impeachment vote on the 17th of October, the nomination of His Excellency Kindiki the same night, and approval by the National Assembly the following morning as evidence that the process was concluded overnight without public input. They distinguished this midterm vacancy scenario from a general election, noting that in elections, the people exercise sovereignty directly through the ballot, whereas in midterm appointments, public participation is the only available mechanism for engaging the people's will. And on that basis, prayed for declaration that the nomination, approval, and appointment of His Excellency Kindiki were unconstitutional. The respondents, quite in summary, maintained that the National Assembly's public participation exercise was adequate, it was reasonable, and fully compliant with the constitutional requirements. They argued that notices were disseminated through the Gazette, through newspapers, through Parliament website, and social media, and that multiple channels of participation were available. They defended the 2 to 3 day notice period as reasonable given the strict timelines under Article 145. They further justified the tick box template as a deliberate design to structure responses and prevent manipulation, noting that citizens could still submit their memoranda or oral views. They argue that participation by over 223,000 citizens was characterized as unprecedented civic engagement, and they dismissed the isolated disruptions as immaterial. They argued that there was no obligation to share His Excellency Gachagua's report with response with the public, since the public's role was to express views, not to adjudicate. On the Senate stage, the respondents, in summary, contended that the public participation was not required as the Senate seats as a quasi-judicial capacity during impeachment and not as a legislature. That Article 118 applied only to legislative business and not impeachment. That impeachment was a single continuous exercise with the public participation required only at the initiation stage. Regarding the nomination and approval of His Excellency Kindiki, they submitted that public participation was not required, that Article 149(1) established a unique self-executing process where the National Assembly voted as an electoral college exercising delegated sovereignty rather than conducting legislative business, that the Constitution's silence on participation in this context was very deliberate, and that elected MPs themselves embody public representation, that the debate was open, televised, and recorded, and they concluded that the nomination, approval, and appointment of His Excellency Kindiki were fully compliant with the Constitution. We have considered the cases advanced by both parties and take the following position on this issue. It is common ground among the parties, and this court affirms that public participation is not merely a procedural formality, but a foundational constitutional value, one deeply woven into the democratic fabric of this nation. It is an expression of the sovereign will of the people, who, by virtue of Article 1, Subarticle 1 of the Constitution, are the ultimate repository of all sovereign power. That sovereignty, though delegated to state organs under Article 1(3), is not thereby surrendered. It is retained by the people and continuously exercised through, amongst other mechanisms, active and meaningful participation in the process of governance. Public participation is therefore not a gift of the state to the citizen, but a constitutional right that the state is obligated to facilitate, to protect, and to give full effect to. Under Article 10(2)(a) of the Constitution, public participation is expressly enumerated as one of the national values and principles of governance. Article 10(1) makes clear that the national values and principles of governance bind all persons, state organs, state officers, and public officers whenever they make or implement public policy decisions, apply or interpret the Constitution or any law. The imperative of public participation finds further and specific expression in the context of Parliament in Article 118 of the Constitution, which reads as follows: Parliament shall A. Conduct its business in an open manner, and its sittings and those of its committees shall be open to the public, and B. Facilitate public participation and involvement in the legislative and other business of Parliament and its committees. At its core, public participation refers to an active process of interaction and engagement among various stakeholders who have an interest in or are affected by a particular decision or course of action. The word active is of constitutional significance. It signals that the Constitution does not contemplate a passive, cosmetic, or performative exercise in which the exercise is merely notified of a decision, in which the public is merely notified of a decision already made. It demands instead a genuine and substantive process which the people are afforded a real and meaningful opportunity to shape the decisions that affect their lives. In essence, public participation is a mechanism through which the governed speak to those who govern, and through which the exercise of public power is continuously tethered to the will, values, and interests of the sovereign people. The robust jurisprudence on this subject in Kenya supports this position. The Supreme Court, in the matter of National Land Commission, this is an advisory opinion application number 2 of 2014, placed the principle of public participation at the very core of the concept of checks and balances in governance, recognizing it as integral to the manner in which various arms of government discharge their constitutional functions. Subsequently, in the British American Tobacco Kenya PLC versus Cabinet Secretary for Ministry of Health, commonly referred to as the BAT case, the Supreme Court delimited the following binding framework for public participation. Principles are that, as a constitutional principle under Article 10(2) of the Constitution, public participation applies to all aspects of governance, that the public officer and or entity charged with the performance of a particular duty bears the honors of ensuring and facilitating public participation, that the lack of a prescribed legal framework for public participation is no excuse for not conducting public participation, and the onus is on the public entity to give effect to this constitutional principle using reasonable means. That public participation must be real and not illusory. It is not a cosmetic or a public relations act. It is not a mere formality to be undertaken as a matter of course, just to fulfill a constitutional requirement. There is need for both quantitative and qualitative components in public participation. That public participation is not an abstract notion, it must be purposeful and meaningful. That public participation must be accompanied by reasonable notice and reasonable opportunity. Reasonableness will be determined on a case-to-case basis. That public participation is not necessarily a process consisting of oral hearings. Written submissions can also be made. The fact that someone was not heard is not enough to annul the process. that allegations of lack of public participation does not automatically vitiate the process. The allegations must be considered within the peculiar circumstance of each case, including the mode, the degree, the scope, the extent of public participation is to be determined on a case-to-case basis. Additionally, in Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury and Planning and 4 others versus Okiya Omtata, the Supreme Court held that the constitutional threshold for public participation is one of reasonableness, that the process must afford the public a genuine and meaningful opportunity to be heard, and that Parliament must take reasonable measures to ensure the proposal, views, and suggestions received. The court spoke as follows. In the BAT case, this court established the standard that duty bearers must meet and the threshold courts should use to determine whether duty bearers have fulfilled their obligations with respect to public participation. This threshold is set at a reasonableness standard. In its guiding principles on public participation, this court defined this threshold as follows: that public participation must be accompanied by reasonable notice and reasonable opportunity. Reasonableness will be determined on a case-to-case basis. Close of quote. This and the broader corpus of jurisprudence firmly established that when the Constitution, the Constitution demands is not necessarily the most intensive form of participation in every case, but always a form that is meaningful, purposeful, and proportionate to the nature and gravity of the decision being made. This principle finds its clearest expression in the decision of the Constitutional Court of South Africa in Doctors for Life International versus the Speaker of National Assembly and others, where the court held that the degree and nature of participation must be calibrated to the subject matter and the potential impact of the decision on affected persons. The proposition has been consistently adopted by our courts in Mui Col Basin Local Community and 15 others versus the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Energy. The Court of Appeal affirmed that decisions of greater consequence demand more robust and substantive engagement, and that public participation ought to be meaningful rather than a tick box exercise. The High Court reinforced this position in Robert Gakuru versus Governor Kiambu County and Institute for Social Accountability versus the National Assembly, where it held that the standard of participation required is directly informed by the gravity and reach of the decision in question. We believe that it is within this rich conceptual context that the courts must approach questions about the adequacy of public participation in any given case, whether arising from the legislative process or from any other exercise of public power in which the Constitution demands the people's involvement. The focus ought to be on whether the participation that occurred was real, substantive, and meaningful. As we now turn to apply these principles to the specific facts of this matter, we do so bearing in mind that the constitutional standard is not one of perfection, but equally, it is not one of mere tokenism. The standard is meaningful participation, and that standard must be assessed with rigor, sensitivity to context, and fidelity to the constitutional vision of a government that is truly of, by, and for the people. Certainly, the impeachment of a deputy president is not an ordinary legislative act. It is amongst the most consequential, solemn, and irreversible decisions that any parliament can make. It involves the removal from office of a person who holds the second highest constitutional office in the republic, and an office to which the holder was elected by the sovereign will of the people through a general election. The gravity of that decision cannot be overstated. It affects not only the individual whose tenure is at stake, but the constitutional architecture of the executive, the stability of government, and the democratic expectations of millions of citizens who cast their vote in the 2022 general election. It is precisely because of this gravity that the public participation required in connection with an impeachment process must be held to a standard that is both qualitatively and quantitatively meaningful. It is equally against this exacting standard that we assess the public participation conducted by the National Assembly in connection with the impeachment of His Excellency